At 0528, lights still glowed across Shcholkovo's hangars, and a cold mist clung to the radar dome. The calm shattered without warning. A scream of cruise missiles cut the pre-dawn air, and in their wake, a swarm of unmanned systems and long-range rounds turned fuel depots, radar sites, and hardened bunkers into burning targets. This was no isolated raid. It was a coordinated saturation strike, engineered to paralyze command long before the defenders could gather themselves. Moments later, a launcher erupted in a column of flame. The war had stepped into a new, harsher phase. What followed was not simply kinetic fury, but a campaign of disruption. While crews scrambled under the thunder of incoming fire, a second wave of robots and recon drones slipped just above rooftop level and began their silent work. They carried no applause of their own. Instead, they wove a dense fog of false signals and thermal decoys across the airfield, feeding the defenders a dozen different emergencies at once. The base's jamming suite, once the lifeline of its signal dominance, flickered and died. In the command bunker, comms went dark. For full seconds, redundant feeds and encrypted links collapsed under invisible pressure. The blackout came not from another explosive strike, but from information being unraveled, circuit by circuit. Then the artillery found the lights. A guided shell tore through the generator housing, and the hangars dimmed. Darkened pylons and cooling towers outlined the airfield as if painted in ash. Alarm klaxons tried to assert order, but the picture on the screens was already smeared. False contacts, phantom heat signatures, and every radar echo a question mark. Launch crews looked at dozens of blips, most contrived, while real threats slipped in unnoticed.
As Russian jets scrambled to reply, long-range interceptors from the Ukrainian side had already stitched a targeting web of their own. High-altitude sensors, drone relays, and precision interceptors converged. Some incoming long-range weapons were taken out in flight. Others spun off course when their navigation was confused. One bomber, hit and leaking fuel, staggered back into the clouds. Another aborted entirely and thudded away. By the time the smoke cleared, the air over Shcholkovo was a cluttered no-fly zone. Ukraine did not pause. With the sky contested and Russian air cover faltering, the ground assault began. Heavy armor moving across cracked service roads in a dispersed formation, infantry following in armored transports, and drones looping above like vultures scouting for the seams. The defenders fought back. Vehicles disgorged from hardened shelters, counting on thick armor and prepared fields of fire. But the attackers had layered their approach. Long-range fire suppression, small robotic engineers clearing paths, and precision strikes directed by unmanned observers. And they exploited every opening. Explosions rocked parking ramps as counter-battery fire met guided shells. Rear ammunition trailers detonated, sending columns of black smoke into the mist. One tank lost its mobility in a shower of sparks and metal. Another slipped sideways and froze, its crew scrambling. The outer perimeter that had been a hardened boundary was now a ragged breach. Smoke poured over the skyline, and the first wave of armored thrusts punched into the inner yards. Inside, scattered firefights and close-quarters clearing turned hangars into chessboards of shattered steel. Mechanized infantry breached doors and moved in methodically. Small autonomous systems, armored, silent, and precise, crawled through culverts and drainage ditches, carrying shaped charges that erased resupply nodes from the map. Ammunition cooked off in chain reactions. The ground rolled with pressure waves that echoed across the base.
The operation's most consequential blow, however, was not the most conspicuous. Below the surface, under layers of concrete and insulation, lay the airfield's data nerve center, a hub that fed live radar, coordinated sorties, and linked the base into a wider network. The attackers had prepared for that dependency. Small electronic attack drones, not built for blast but for blackout, closed in and dumped overwhelming interference across critical relay bands. The facility's internal mesh shutters flickered, backup systems strained and failed. Before technicians could reroute, a low-flying missile guided by an unseen spotter punched through the reinforced roof,
its warhead detonating after a delay and shredding servers, hard drives, and cooling systems 2 floors down. The command lines that once pulsed with orders fell silent. When the hub collapsed, the airfield's role as a launch node evaporated. Coordinated bomber sorties grounded, launch windows vanished, long-range flights were forced to redeploy to distant strips. The base had not merely been battered, it had been surgically blinded. Russia answered with volume. Trucked rocket systems fired salvos toward the approaching armor, but layered air defenses and active drone intervention intercepted many of those rounds. Others were disrupted by small, guided, unmanned interceptors that detonated before impact. The rhythm of counterfire could not restore the lifeblood of command and control. Without it, responses were disjointed, slow, and piecemeal. Ukraine pressed its advantage rather than hold ground. Infantry and armor pushed to the inner taxiways, drone coverage fed targeting data to gunners and mortarmen, logistics nodes and radar arrays went dark or into flaming ruin. The attackers took what they had come for, not carved occupation, but decisive attrition. Command capability severed, launch capacity crippled, supply nodes gutted. The airfield was not occupied as a base of operations, it was dismantled as an instrument of power. Farther south, the assault pressure did not relent. A concerted operation struck the capital's fuel network. Loitering munitions and kamikaze drones converged on a major refinery, turning tanks and processing towers into towering pillars of flame. Simultaneous sabotage of critical feed lines, charges revealed in the ground beneath pipelines, ruptured arteries that fed the facility. Fire crews fought under impossible conditions. Water bombers and helicopters tried to douse towering infernos, but were driven off by swarms that kept the airspace contested. What was designed as a strike on assets quickly became a strike on reach. Damage to the refinery threatened the fuel lifeline for broad military operations. Across the theater, the pattern was clear. The campaign was less about seizing acres and more about removing key pieces from a much larger network. Command nodes, fuel depots, logistics hubs, and relay arrays. Each destroyed piece widened a seam in the enemy's fabric of operations. Every burned warehouse, every ruined server room and ruptured pipeline forced recalculation hours and miles away. When the day's strikes finally ebbed, Shcholkovo lay strategically gutted. Radar arrays and communication nodes were gone. Refueling and launch capacity had been blunted. Bombers that once lifted from its runways would now be routed farther away and arrive later, if at all. The attackers did not occupy the base. They left sensors and small sentries behind, watched as salvage and emergency teams streamed in and moved on. In the quiet that followed, the scale of the impact settled in. An air hub rendered impotent, a refinery crippled, and a ring of operations suddenly less secure.
And yet, even among the smoldering metal and smoking roadways, small acts of humanity remained. A field medic reached a wounded technician and offered water. A drone operator hovered over an abandoned helmet and called in coordinates for recovery. In a conflict defined by networks and steel, those small moments continued to puncture the story with something human. The air over the region remained full of the residue of engagement, the clatter of distant intercepts, the faint beeping of residual sensors, the silhouette of drones circling like small patient sentries, until one by one they slipped away. The day's operation had been ruthless and exacting. It left behind not only wreckage and flame, but a changed operational map. Command was degraded, reach was diminished. The calculus of strikes, sorties, and supply would not be the same again. Where once the defenders had relied on a dense web of layers to secure launches and logistics, the attackers had shown how to unravel that web, not in a single thunderous blow, but through a sequence of precise, interconnected moves, disruption, deception, and sudden, surgical violence, each one taking advantage of the enemy's dependence on centralized systems. The result was both material and psychological, a strategic warning that in the modern fight, control of the sky and the network can be as decisive as control of the ground. When the last fires finally burned low and the morning light bled through smoke, The landscape was changed. Towers, hangars, and pipes were scarred. The air smelled of diesel and ruin. The map of influence had shifted a little farther from those who had expected to be safe. The operation at Shcholkovo and the strike on the refinery together spoke to a new reality. In this war, a base can be dismantled as completely by signals and small machines as by battalions. The question now was whether lines could be rebuilt fast enough to matter, or whether the next move would be the one that could not be answered at all. The inferno at Kapatina was still raging when the second act of the assault began to unfold. Flames painted the night sky like a man-made sunrise. Russia's air defense network scrambled to respond as sirens wailed across Moscow. Radar operators shouted coordinates, locking on to fast-moving contacts. Within minutes, Su-35 flankers and MiG-31 Foxhounds screamed off runways at over 1,500 miles per hour, climbing sharply into the glowing horizon to intercept.
But Ukraine had anticipated this reaction. As the Mil-8 helicopters retreated from the burning refinery, radar signatures of Ukrainian Su-27s and MiG-29s appeared at the edge of Moscow's airspace. They didn't rush in recklessly. Instead, they hovered at the perimeter, teasing the Russian defenses, daring them to respond. The plan was simple but deadly. Force Russian fighters and SAM batteries to expose their positions, then drain them through maneuver, misdirection, and bait. At 20,000 feet, contrails cut across the blackness. Missiles streaked through the clouds, long-range R-33s tearing the sky apart, traveling nearly 60 miles before detonating. Ukrainian pilots countered with barrel rolls and chaff bursts, sending those missiles spiraling into empty air. Su-27s retaliated with heat-seeking fire, forcing Russian jets into steep climbs that devoured fuel. The airspace above Moscow became a chessboard of smoke and thunder. Each move met with flares, jamming signals, and split-second turns. On the ground, S-400 launchers at Moscow's perimeter unleashed salvo after salvo, lighting the horizon with white plumes. But Ukrainian electronic warfare units pulsed the airwaves, distorting radar and breaking missile locks. Explosions flashed harmlessly in the clouds above. For civilians below, the sky was a nightmare ballet. Streaks of light zigzagged between the stars. Echoes of thunder rolled across the sleeping city. But what they didn't see was the precision, the tactical brilliance at work. The Ukrainian fighters weren't seeking victory in the air. They were creating a diversion, pulling Russia's elite pilots higher, farther, isolating them from their defenses and stretching command response time to the breaking point. By the time the first Russian Su-35 circled back toward the inferno at Kapatina, the damage was irreversible. Moscow's skies were no longer secure. Their fuel hub burned unchecked, and the war for control had entered a new, unforgiving phase. Above, the dogfight raged, but below, the real strike force was already moving. From the southern industrial belt came the low, thunderous growl of engines. Columns of T-84 Oplot tanks crushed the asphalt beneath them, advancing with unstoppable force toward the burning refinery. Flanking them came something the Russians had not expected: squads of Ukrainian infantry mounted on dirt bikes. They weaved between tanks like hornets, darting down narrow streets, one soldier driving, the other armed with a launcher or carbine. Their mission: speed, infiltration, chaos. They were there to sever communication lines before Russian security could regroup. And then came the strangest sight of all: men pedaling toward the front on bicycles rigged with explosives. The suicide wheels, as they were called, weren't meant to live long. They were decoys, rolling towards secondary fuel depots and storage sheds. Their explosions were smaller, but psychologically devastating. Panic spread faster than fire. At 4:49 a.m., the next hammer fell. From hidden positions outside the city, Ukraine's mobile rocket batteries came alive. Dozens of rockets sliced through the sky, slamming into warehouses, storage yards, and auxiliary tanks.
The impacts tore open silos, sending burning oil surging like rivers of fire. The ground trembled as chain reactions ripped through the outer defenses. With Moscow's shield crumbling, Ukrainian infantry surged deeper. Tanks blasted holes through perimeter walls, their 125mm cannons vaporizing barricades and fortified checkpoints. Smoke and dust blanketed the compound as bike-mounted infantry swerved past wreckage, laying suppressive fire on retreating Russian troops. By the time reinforcements tried to regroup, it was too late. The battlefield was fragmented. Tanks dominated choke points, bikes ruled the alleys, and rockets sealed escape routes. Russian commanders screamed for order, but comms were jammed, lines severed. What began as a drone raid had evolved into a full-scale mechanized incursion. For the first time, Moscow's defenders faced the war not from distant skies, but up close. The refinery was already a storm of fire when the next wave arrived. Not human, but mechanical. Towering robotic war machines, over 10 feet tall and weighing several tons, rolled through the smoke. Hydraulic limbs dragged howitzers that barked relentlessly, pulverizing strongholds into rubble. Smaller mine-laying drones scuttled like metallic spiders across the streets, planting shaped charges and mines along every route. Within minutes, a fiery ring encircled the refinery. Russian reinforcements advancing from the east found their armored vehicles torn apart by unseen blasts. The assault stalled instantly. Desperate, the Kremlin deployed Rosgvardia, Russia's National Guard, supported by armored personnel carriers. They stormed forward into the inferno. But Ukrainian mini-drones were waiting. Swarms of FPVs plunged from the sky, each carrying just enough explosive to cripple a vehicle or scatter a squad. The result was pure devastation. Armored trucks erupted in flames. Troop columns broke apart in confusion. Larger combat robots advanced behind the chaos, shredding bunkers while dirt bike infantry swept through the ruins. By 5:10 a.m., the battlefield had transformed once again. The refinery was surrounded by an autonomous steel ring, a hybrid army of men and machines working in perfect synchronization. Russia had expected tanks and drones. It had not expected this, a full robotic assault. Machines that fought without fear, without fatigue, without mercy. The message was undeniable. The age of robotic warfare had arrived at Moscow's gates. But Ukraine wasn't done. At 5:22 a.m., deep within Ukrainian-held territory, long-range cruise missiles ignited the sky. Simultaneously, UAVs armed with glide bombs soared above the smoke, diving in coordinated arcs toward the refinery's most vulnerable assets, the massive storage tanks. The impact was cataclysmic. The first missile's detonation sent a shockwave that rattled windows for miles. Seconds later, the glide bombs struck, igniting secondary explosions that turned the night into day. Towers of flame climbed thousands of feet into the air, black smoke blotting out the horizon. Inside Moscow, panic spread through command centers. Air defense crews, already stretched thin, scrambled to reassign batteries. S-400 launchers were pulled from the city's heart to defend the refinery's remains, leaving Moscow's core exposed. And that was the trap. The refinery's destruction was no longer the objective. It was bait. By drawing defenses southward, Ukraine had created a gaping hole over the capital itself. What began as a localized strike had become a strategic masterstroke. When the last missile struck, Kapotina was gone. The refinery was a graveyard of steel and smoke. Pipelines ruptured, tanks gutted, production silenced. Strategically, Russia's fuel heart had been torn out, and its capital left vulnerable. In the aftermath, Ukrainian units rescued surviving workers and wounded Russians, proving the target had never been civilians, only war infrastructure. As dawn broke, all that remained was silence. Smoke coiled upward from the ruins. twisting into the cold Moscow sky. And in that silence, one truth echoed through every command bunker. If Kapotina could fall, what was truly safe?